The island of Sodor is known for its railway, the North Western Railway. The railway has now existed for over 100 years and it continues to prosper. However, it hasn't been without trouble. While the railway carries a rather clean safety record, it's not to say it's completely spotless. In this video, I'll go over the island's worst accidents. Here we go. Right, we'll actually go back to before the North Western Railway. We're back in the days of the Sodor and Mainland Railway, and we're back in 1907. Around this time, the railway had seen the introduction of its largest locomotive ever, a massive 460 express locomotive named Mr. Mr. was built at Crovan's Gate and was said to have been built in order to meet future demands for express trains. However, many have been confused as to the importance of its construction, since many have deemed that the railway never needed more than a 440 for express services. What I'm saying is that the railway wasn't ready for a 460, and this soon became apparent with the presence of Mr. On July 3rd, 1907, Mr. was hauling an express train from Barrow-in-Furness to Kirk Ronan. He usually operated on the railway's line to Kildane, however he was filling in for another locomotive. By this point, however, the railway had experienced lots of financial trouble due to heavy investments in other fields. This resulted in track conditions being somewhat bad in certain places. This was especially true for the line to Kirk Ronan. Track quality was already bad enough for a 440, but for a 460, it would prove to be dangerous. Just before Rolf's castle, the track gave way under Mr., sending him down an embankment. The resulting pileup took the life of 23 people in the island's first major railway accident. This sent the railway's reputation on a plummet, and it was clear that change was needed. Mr. would never run another day on the Sodor Mainland Railway, and he was eventually sold to the North Eastern Railway. The railway itself managed to recover from the crash, however, not for long. But that's a story for another day. In 1930, the North Western Railway would see its first fatal railway accident. By then, the railway was looking into getting more express locomotives to help Gordon out. During 1930, two locomotives were trialled. These were Crovan and Alfred. Crovan, while his performance was slightly underwhelming in the beginning, eventually improved and he became a great performer. Alfred, on the other hand, was downright reckless. Later reports showed that Alfred had been reported of speeding no less than 15 times during his trial. He was also known for being very early with his trains. Too early, in fact, due to his speeding. This would come back to bite him in the tender, massively. On the 8th of May, 1930, Alfred was going the fastest he had ever gone. Approaching Lower Knapford, he was going more than double the speed limit. He didn't care though. After almost running into Henry and Crovan, Alfred would enter a curve just beyond the station, albeit a little bit too fast. The resulting carnage took the life of 26 people, taking the title as the island's worst railway accident. After the crash, Alfred's trial was promptly terminated, and he was quickly sent back to the LNER. Crovan ended up staying after his trial. In terms of death toll, this accident remains the island's second worst. In terms of popularity, however, it doesn't even come close. Well, we've made it. We've made it to the most infamous railway accident that's ever happened on Sodor, the Kildane crash, or as it's more popularly known, the Flying Kipper crash. Yeah, I've talked about it before, but for the sake of the video, I'll do it again. Wintertime isn't usually the best time for the railway. Far from it actually. Snow and ice have a great effect on the railway's efficiency and reliability, and 1935 was an especially bad year. This had a massive effect on travel time for both goods and passenger trains. Every train in fact, except for the Flying Kipper. The Flying Kipper is the island's famous fish train that carries a huge responsibility, as a large portion of the island's general income is based upon its fishing industry. To avoid any alterations and delays, the train runs very early in the morning, with top priority. But in the environment of January 1935, this may not have been the best thing. On January 18th, 1935, at 5 o'clock, Henry went out with the Flying Kipper for yet another regular run. He made good time and passed Kronk as per usual. However, up ahead, an early goods train headed by Donald had suffered a hotbox and was thus waiting for it to cool down. Henry was originally to be diverted to the other line, however this didn't happen as the points themselves had frozen solid. And, well, I think you know what happened next. The Kildane crash would go down as the most infamous railway accident on Sodor. There were no casualties from the crash, as everybody had gotten out of the way, but there was still a lot of damage. Henry suffered the most from the crash, but it would later turn out to be a blessing for him, as it ended up being a perfect opportunity for a rebuild. The crash itself became so infamous given that it was all at the hands of Mother Nature, and an axle box that had suffered from poor maintenance. One thing about the crash though is that in terms of casualties, overall damage and effect on the railway, it pales in comparison to the worst one yet. Here we are. We've made it to the worst railway accident that's ever happened on Sodor. In terms of fatalities, overall damage and effect, no other Sudrian accident comes close. On June 3rd, 1952, Adam was running up the Brandon branch with a regular goods train. However, upon entering the junction to the main line, the set of points he crossed suddenly locked in the other direction and he was knocked across the main line. Adam's derailment meant that the main line was now blocked. Sadly, at that very moment, Reginald was just descending Gordon's Hill at an incredibly high speed, and unfortunately there wasn't much that anybody could do. Despite Reginald seeing the blockade well ahead, with his speed and the overall weight of his train, there was little he could do to stop a disaster. The Wellsworth crash was nothing less than gut-wrenching. When the smoke had settled, a terrible sight was revealed. To this day, it remains among the worst disasters the island has ever seen, with a death toll of 44 people. Alan was mostly out of the way, so he remained pretty much undamaged. Reginald, on the other hand, was knocked out cold, but he thankfully recovered from it. The entire mainline was cut in half, and it took over a week to get trains up and running again. But probably the most interesting part about this accident was the fallout. Immediate suspicions were raised about the railway's then Track Maintenance Association, SUDRAC, which had been established as part of the nationalization of 1948. These assumptions turned out to be true, as the board was found to be piled with corruption, which in turn meant that their maintenance work had been mediocre at best, something that Harvey and Mickey had strongly opposed. Their opinions, however, had been overlooked by the people in charge, and they were even sidelined at one point in favor of a new Linear L1 tank engine named Mason. Mason lacked experience in maintenance, and thus just followed whatever the board was saying. Topham was heavily against the new arrangements, but he was overruled by British Railways. Things, however, were quickly changed following the accident, as following the crash, heaps of changes and adjustments were made in order for such a tragedy to never happen again. The old system was quickly abolished and the fire and rescue service was just as quickly reinstated. Mickey and Harvey would then carry out a huge overhaul of the Northwestern signaling system, electronic points, and generally just lots of upgrades to the infrastructure to bring it up to date. This fallout and aftermath is why the accident remains among the most important events for the railway, and it worked for a very long time. The railway wouldn't see another major accident for the next 67 years. But yes, that means there's still one more accident to cover. By 2019, the entire Northwestern Main Line had been upgraded to 125 miles an hour, and the section between Kildane and Barrow Furness was being electrified. This meant that speeds had increased dramatically. By now, the fastest engines on the island were the Peel Goddard electric engines and the Pancras Special crew, consisting of Archer, Torch, Shane, Pip and Emma. This service had proven to be incredibly popular, even surpassing ridership numbers when compared to air travel. In order for such high speeds to be allowed, several safety standards were implemented along with several upgrades to existing infrastructure. However, one thing that had been left out of the question was level crossings, and sadly this would be the reason for an unfortunate tragedy. On September 24th, 2019, Archer was returning from Pancras with a fully loaded passenger train. Traveling along the Crosby Strait, he was going full speed. However, up ahead, a car was driving along the road. The car in question was driven by Caleb Miles, a local baker of Crosby. Unfortunately, he had been suffering from a severe depression for a while now, and on this day, he had had enough. Without much hesitation, he drove straight through the barrier, onto the railway track, where he would stop the car. It was a suicide attempt, and sadly, it went according to his wishes. Traveling at over 100 miles an hour, Archer was derailed when he hit the car, and traveled several hundred yards before coming to a stop. The resulting carnage was widespread, with the entire mainline being blocked yet again. The crash took the life of 16 people, Caleb included, who was killed on impact. Following the crash, the Sudrian therapy sector received improved funding from the government to ensure that mental health was taken better care of. Also following the crash, several proposals were put forward on how to avoid this from happening again. Some differed from either being a strengthening of existing barriers or a rerouting of the roads either above or below the railway. However, as per with the events of 2020, progress on this matter has been slower than hoped. But for the time, the railway is in the process of strengthening the barriers for future safety. So, here's hoping that that'll be enough to stop it from happening again. And there you go. While this was far from the happiest video I've ever made, it's still a very important topic to cover, so I hope that you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.